Nhớ rằng cho lên sự tướng đã là của Yahweh này cả trong xe đã tạo tuần trí này được sở hữu sự kiêu nó. Và thế kia xe thì nên số lên sự tướng trí kiến là cá như rong. Nếu nào của Yah trả lời nhận tuần ó trong đời ra đã nâng hữu hải tìa cho lưu chúa tuần ý nhớ trong của video below. Nhớ thì đến từ sự tóm lòng tuần ý để kèm lòng ta mà lên lòng pa ó nó. Lần đó cuối cùng kể lại dễ ý plea. As soon as they were safely inside Jialia's chamber, Shuaking released her, and she stepped away from him as he closed the door. When he reached to inspect the mark on her neck again, she pushed his hand away. He raised a questioning eyebrow at her as she glared at him with hateful eyes. He smiled and crossed his arms as he watched her become even angrier. Gutami taja, khati khaka kidona. Khai tia lutun tau ko la ya tia kumoy tumi maumina, he asked. She laughed. Kuchikiko. Kasai tia. Ku tau lumbe wa ka tumi ne che e te tu pa ne kai di pa de ki yo ata ku ki na lo. Ka shi la ka chu ya shi ni ke se. Tu mon ben da ka ni ya ku. Tu shi ka nyang jong hai tia ya ko wa ku lumbe po. Ti ku ko wa tia de ka te na. He dropped his arms and a serious expression came over him. Hari ka tsai tau li kya. Jialia moved to where he stood. Ku chi kon jai hai tia kan lang tu pu. Ta shi. Jing pu ka te mau me la jai ku. Ka ching ka tao á. Chi li. Ku yu wa ka mi blunt day kia. She didn't expect that Shoking would do as he did. He reached over, grabbed her arms, and planted a long, wet kiss on her. When she tried to push him away, he simply grabbed both of her hands with one of his and deepened the kiss. He stopped when he was satisfied, and she looked up with angry eyes. She said. Chia, he said with a grin. Cô sai có chuyện có xứ xã lo. Họ nói vậy họ kể trâu chỉ mấy đứa có để gia tận đây nọ. Giờ có giờ hay lưu sai sự tao cô này cái của trâu chỉ nên làm gì? Chuyện yêu quá cha li khó nó của thia. Sai cái lúc họ nhau cái rong mình gì? Có tính gì nhỉ thia? Hay lưu cái chuyện nhau đi của lúc bé mà. He pushed her aside and then opened the door, ushering Lo Ying in, who had a salve for her injury. Shua Keng entered his chamber to find Paraki waiting for him on his bed, wearing a very thin nightgown. She sat up, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders. In the past, he'd had her in his bed up until dawn, where he kicked her out. But tonight, all he could think about was another woman who was a few doors away from him. A smile appeared on her face as she pretended to look exhausted. He asked. The smile on her face disappeared. He laughed as he began to move his armor. It was heavy, and she got up to assist him, but he stopped her. Muda kalutsa. Kalutsa na chitsai toko. Yavilika. No kulikotela. He removed the cloak and dropped it on the floor, and she began pouting. He hated women who pouted. It was annoying and childish. He opened the door as she looked up at him. Mu, he ordered. Thao kucheng hai zhong gachi mu. She stomped her foot and left as he closed the door behind him. He finished undressing and had just reached for the white tunic when a knock came on the door. He opened it, and Gongji walked in bearing a smile and looking at him with a grin. Lin bảo Lin nói lấy cái chuyện lo đó chi nà, Sure King said. Oh, tí của bà bà đã kỹ tự tí thư kì kì của thế li sau hai tí hiểu đi chả đó. Đó là, ở nhà có nhớ ý lần nọ. Cũng cho sứ trong này có thứ một bản địa xã, Gongji said. Mà đã chỉ hai gì hai chỉ cho à? Lần thứ hai của bụi lần nữa nè. Cũng chẳng mà cũng sao hơn lửa món đồ của ô hả? Gongji laughed. Ô cái trong mình gì á? Trái bị lo chỉ sao sửa gì lo một tí một thiệt ô lửa tụ nè. His friend left, and Shogun closed the door, letting out an exhausting breath. It had been a long day of war talk, and he had hoped that he wouldn't have to go to another battle. But his father had different thoughts. The meeting he attended earlier with his father had him on the edge of his seat. The new lands he had gained from marrying Jialia wasn't enough for his father's greed. He wanted more, and that meant their neighboring land his father had set eyes on for decades. He had tried to avoid this particular part of the land because these were the people of his mother. But his father didn't care. He just wanted to rule the entire four corners of the world. A lonely fool and ruler, he always thought of his father. He came to sit down on the bed and rubbed his face. The scars on his cheeks made his heart ache heavily. It had been a long time since it bothered him, but he knew that every time his wife looked at him, it was all she saw. It was all anyone saw, actually, and before he never cared. But tonight, when he saw how Baraki treated his wife, and how she had reacted in the privacy of her own chamber, he knew that her thoughts meant the world to him. Why? He wasn't sure, because no woman had ever reached that place. But now that she was his, he would aim to protect her, even if he had to question every single act along the way. Shuokeng descended down the stairs to find Jialia dressed in the lavender gown that made her glow. She was putting freshly picked flowers into a vase on the table. When she looked up, he smiled at her and her eyes darkened. She was probably still mooning over the kiss he gave her. As he rounded the corner, Gongchi entered the dining hall, and Shokeng saw the reaction of his wife's flushed cheeks. This made him feel a tick inside his heart. "Nhớ Shenza," Gongchi said, smiling toward Angelia. She returned a warm smile and replied, "Nhớ rong, tonto unachai." Shokeng rolled his eyes. "Gongchi, bao cho to se, nushi bao chai bla." This got an angry glare from Jialia, who ushered Lo Ying in with a plate of freshly made waffles and strawberries for Gongchi. La, la Gong ư. Lo Ying brought in another two plates, and the three of them sat down. Shuokeng watched as his wife conversed with his general with a smile that he hadn't yet seen for him. This made him angry, and right as he was about to intrude on their conversation, Bareki walked in, bearing a plate of warm apple pie. She came to set it down right in front of him, and he saw his wife's reaction. So, she pretended not to care. He could play this game. He picked up a fork and took a bite, proclaiming it as the best pie in the entire world. Wow, Bareki, 不要跟我拿，我家有木卡早烧了，he said. She smiled. "Yakama? Tiya ko tan tan da ko sa ke lu tia. Oh, ta ka mo li no. Du wo, ta ye o chua chi tao no do liao. Ku sai thou ma, ka tu mu no, pa da ki lo mi ti apo ta lo sha." Kong Chi said with a half grin. Shuoken glared at his general. "Ka tsa halu mi ji ya." "O cha?" Jalia asked. "Halina tsao ka la?" Ku sai jong li ka te pa da ki ne shi shin ya le ge. Kong Chi, la e ư kiên ga nhau ke. Landa kumutauke. He watched as his wife got up, took the hand of his general, and the two left together. He dropped the fork on the plate where it clattered loudly. As Bareki smiled beside him, he stood up and pushed her aside, causing her to stumble where he didn't even care as he chased after his wife. The wind was gentle but cold as Jialia and Gongchi walked down the hill toward the archery field. He took off his cloak and wrapped it around her as they made their way in. He picked up an arrow and bow and turned around to look at her, with a smile on his face. "Gaba tao shi to neng te su dua?" he asked. Gu shi tao à? Gu shi sơ? Gaba sa ke? Gu ma khai la tao?" He gently took her arm and led her to stand in front of him. He placed the arrow in and helped her raise to aim at the target. "Ka tu yeng jiwa? Ye ka lu ha pia. Da shi, ye ka chi wa ti rong shai. Ye ka kia nu pa ka tsa kin chai. Ni yeng tao ka tsa ke kia tu. Tao na. Ka cha su ke, ye to chin ya." He released the arrow and it hit slightly off the target. "Whoa! What ya jeng lo liao?" Jialia said as she controlled her breathing. "Jeng ma." Li na to ka nya ho ha cha. Ka te le keng chi tao. Ka pa sa shi. Saka. Gongchi helped her place another arrow in, and as she pulled and aimed, Shuaking came over the hill, yelling her name. She turned and accidentally released the arrow where it flew and scratched his arm. He cursed as she dropped the bow on the ground and began running to him. Shuaking! Tatsia! Kapawalika! She cried as she bent down to him. His arm had a very small wound from the scratch, and although it was bleeding, it wasn't enough to make him groan. But because he was upset, he ended up moaning loudly, and then he reached over, grabbed the back of her head, and pulled her in for a kiss. She fought him off and stood up as Gongchi came to their side. Shuoking stood and took her wrist, turning to go when she tried to stop him. Cho cô na, she cried. Cơ tư tua của lấy cái chuyện mà chạy lật tự của thế lọ, Shuoking said. You're gay sila ma, Gongchi said. Cho san tao ma. Go go look on yo, Shuoking ordered. Mu. Doku mu. He began dragging her up the hill and then noticed that she was still wearing Gongchi's cloak. He stopped, took it off, and threw it at his general. He took his cloak off and tried to put it around her, but she jerked her arm free and ran off ahead of him. Shuoking turned back around to face Gongchi. Jake, yeah. He warned. Gongchi smiled. Cú chỉ tao là tia. Cú sai rong lì có mong có kể là rèn đó lửa tuổi. Cú bá cần ra lì lúc sẽ hở. Lông lỡ dùng gì sao? Con nhỏ có chờ. She hadn't meant to harm him. It was purely an accident. But because she hadn't expected him to show up the way he did, she had frightened herself and accidentally released the arrow. Now, her husband sat in bed with a bloody bandage on his arm. The look he gave her was pure betrayal. The king had heard of her injuring his son and had entered the mansion on a rampage demanding she give her reasonings. She had none, which made him even angrier until Shoking stepped in to calm his father down. Now, as the servants made their way out of the chamber, he stood up, half naked, scars and anger all over his face, a mixture that had her trembling where she stood. Kasalika, Katelina Kunchimu. Kayakutu. Oya Katelichi Samoa, he asked. She perked her head up. Gucci Samoa. Ay kone. Kumambay wakututsi. Teshimantu. Katupau kay tulusundia. Kana ni handan ya katuna. He smiled, and she realized her mistake too late. Oh, yaka sapao kulusundia. O yaka chiwati rong hai se. Yala hai de kui lan ka pushi rong se lama. She ignored his prideful grin, but he made his way to her and leaned down low to her ear. Yan rong tia, zeka chi sa tao kula. Kumo chong ling tao tuan chen cha kuna. She grinned. Oli, kuma kia lu ten cha ka sa. Sa tsi ka la tsa ko kien chay ka tu chi mo zhang le. As he reached for her, the drums alerting intruders were sounded. Shoking turned and walked to the window where he saw men at arms preparing for battle. He cursed as he threw on his tunic and made a face when the movement caused his entry to bleed again. Gatita mala. Gasamu, Jialia said. He smiled. Kanameme sa gutamitaja. Nyatiyina satala. He left and ordered 2 men at arms to position themselves at her door. She rushed to the window and saw him walking out already in full armor. He got on his horse, and as he rode out, he turned to glance once behind at her. Shuoking arrived at the entrance of the castle walls, where Gongchi was positioned in the front in full armor with his sword ready. His men at arms were all ready for war as he got off his horse and Gongchi came to his side. Mochileng, Jeko Patututa. Shuoking froze, and he turned to look at his men. Beichelo Chipa. Yaoya. Lung Tia to Tuatsan the Betoche. His father came riding in and got off his horse. Con trai lo, khi kia khỏi trong sơ, kia sẽ lợi hành bảo lý tư, kia ô trò, lần tư số kiện kể, tuần đấy tụ số dân sơ. Khi khỏi trong, tỏ trò, số cảnh sát, gì, kia cũng đó là thả sẽ, mua đã chi tia. Kia ô trò chỉ mua lù, chúng muốn ta tên hứng sân à. Before Shokin could stop his father, he jumped on his horse and demanded the drawbridge opened. He rode right through, and Shokin rode out after his father. The war cry was loud as they poured out and right into the field where the other side was waiting for them. It was none other than King Ketu, his mother's brother, who was waiting. Their colors of red and blue waved in the air, and his father came to a stop. "Got tora chi zang de gu va gu jeli na," his father cried. "Nam ma, got cho neng to la gu ja de o de gu ja neng to la in da. Got sai de gu shpao na la," Kietu said. This shocked Shuokeng, and he watched as his father laughed. The other army was ready to fight, and he knew that if there was a war, they would lose, and lose more than they had enough to give away. Without waiting for his father's approval, he rode off ahead and met his uncle on his side. His uncle wasn't a bad person. He was just a little impatient, but he had always been a good man. "Chỉ hoa tại kia tu, thọ có tí cả, lúc nào chỉ rong đồ lăng tiêu cho cho, khó lo chấp lời, thọ có sang được của nhẹ. Giờ cái gì chỉ sáu thua của vậy, cũng chỉ tốt chân rồi nè. Ta chỉ cái gì sát đâu khó lo khó rong khó yên sư. Lúc nào, cũng giờ kia kể kể được cái gì sư đi ta." "Dallo," Shokin said as he got off his horse. He walked over and took the reins of the horse of his uncle's. "Kuwa tu taka." "Shokin!" His father's voice loudly rang. "Go chi ying cao jiao." Without listening to his father, Shokin fell to his knees, and right at that moment, his father fired an arrow that shot through his left shoulder. He fell over as his uncle dropped down from his horse and helped him. "Mi tu, ka sali ya ka te oli na." "Dallo, ku thọ ka, giờ cái trường vợ cho cụ tụi tụi thế kì, cho cụ chia ai kia đi tì ra cáo ổn đây cụ chịu hàng cho nó, cụ thọ cái tia." He saw his uncle's broken face as he let him go and got back on his horse, retreating his army back and away. Shokin heard horse hooves and saw his father arrive to him. "Nia tu tua," he shouted as he got off the horse, and with that, his father kicked him in the face, causing darkness to take over him. Shuokeng woke to find Jialia leaning on one hand, falling asleep, while sitting beside him in bed. His jaw ached, and his shoulder felt as if it had been ripped apart. He tried to move and couldn't, which stirred her, and she opened her eyes. She reached over and steadied him. "Santi, chai ple ka hang kai ta lan cha. Ka sa to chi?" she asked gently. "Gu pu ta chen hula." She almost paled at his question. "Ka pu ta an hula. Gu tsai ka khung gao. Ka bo ja. Je ka chai pla hang ba. Je ku mu ya ka ma do ka na." She turned to go, but he reached out to take her hand. She sat back down and took his hand in hers. "Keku, oli yala," he asked. She took a deep breath. "Thao ka chi na. Ka si. Je hua tai kia tu ka. Te shi la tu mu de hang la. Lu da la son ni ki hang. Tao ape nu na. Chi pa ka si la. Sha le ku chi pa ai de nu mu do tu la." Sure King let out a deep breath. "Ku thao si. Ka thao si wa da chi na. Ku thao si tia. Ka pa ku zhong ni na." She reached over and brushed a strand of hair away from his face. He suddenly felt sad because that was a gesture his mother used to do. And then her fingers fell to his scars on his face. "Goodbye, dear. Good day, got your plan the ga, nu chi shine," he said. "Bomala," she asked gently. "Jinwa. The she ye ka gun gu gu ya ti mu ta gu shi neng. Gu yin che chi dao. Gu chi sali ga. Gu mun ba ya ka ma da ga na cha. Ta ka chi samu. Ta ka nya da gu yi ple pa tao. Tao ka." And as he turned to watch her sweet face, she gave him a gentle smile that reminded him of the beauty of his mother. He felt safe and closed his eyes, drifting off to sleep as she held his hand. 我之后那时候整了巩固着东澳洲啥的呢，讲了久啊，东北有的是啥等待呢，北马来西亚的啊。